All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast to coast radio show all about the information economy. It's called Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh. And I'm very pleased to have a speaker from the Linux Foundation, the European chapter of the Linux Foundation, with us today. As all of you know, I'm a huge fan of open source technology. I believe that open source has really helped us level up across the board in the world of software and technology over the past 30 years. Quite frankly, Linux, of course, played a huge part in that. Linus Torvalds, but also all the other Apache projects and Linux Foundation projects, CNCF, the Cloud Native Computer Foundation, I think is what it stands for, CNCF. Lots and lots and lots of open source technology out there. And today we're going to be talking to Mirko Boehm of the Linux Foundation, and he knows a lot about this EU Cyber Resiliency Act that's been passed that has a lot of impact. It has people scratching their heads and wondering, what do we do? So, Mirko, with that, tell us a bit about first of all, the Cyber Resilience Act. What does it basically say? I'm guessing it is trying to achieve a level of responsible behavior in the industry, which is always a bit challenging. But what does it say, and how do you interpret that, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so it's actually quite a fascinating new law, I have to say. As you say, it is the intention of the law is to raise the general level of cybersecurity across the board for all digital products. And as such, it imposes things like reporting requirements for fixing security issues when they're detected over longer, extended support periods, 5 years or more. So basically, the act aims at encouraging manufacturers to behave in a responsible way, essentially in a way that we've been advocating for a long time. So the policy goals of the act are, I think, very well accepted and welcomed by many people. One additional goal is to enable consumers to inform themselves about which products are well supported and when they choose products. So I think that's also important.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and of course, people know about GDPR, the
mhm.
General Data Protection Regulation, which really puts the onus on organizations to be very careful with their data, to be careful about how they collect data. So in this sense, we're focused more on responsible use of the technology and safeguards and things of this nature. But what are the penalties? I mean, there's always a carrot and a stick, right? What's the stick if a company does not do what they're supposed to do according to this act?
The penalties can be stiff, so 2.5% of global turnover. So it's a
Wow,
huge amount.
geez.
And I think the general intention is to say um, the penalties are declared to be so stiff that nobody ever wants to face them.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's one key takeaway for our listeners is if you're a manufacturer, if you're bringing products into the European market, this is not something that you can just sit out or ignore. So it's very important.
Well, and so
Yeah.
this affects manufacturers of digital and connected products. It affects, of course, software developers and businesses using digital products. And the basic requirements revolve, as I understand it, around making sure you're conducting cybersecurity risk assessments, making sure you're implementing security by design principles. I mean, it's basic stuff. Ensure products receive timely security updates. Always be wary of the update. I
Mhm.
always joke about that. The updates can cause you trouble. And the thing with security, and I'm just guessing here, so tell me if I'm wrong. Usually, if you have a good plan in place from a corporate perspective, you adhere to that plan, you follow that plan, you're trying to do the right thing. Then, if something bad happens, at least you can say to the auditors or the regulators, look, this is our plan, this is what we're doing, this is how we addressed it. And if you've done those things, you should be okay. But if you've not done those things, that's when you get in trouble. Is that right?
Yeah, so first of all, the way you describe it is this is what a good actor should do, a
Hmm.
company that takes cybersecurity seriously. And yes, you're right. If you act this way, then you've done like say 50%. The other 50% are there are prescriptions for the mitigation procedure, the reporting procedure, deadlines for how much time do you have to do an initial report, etc. So you also have to diligently handle the issue. That's what I'm saying. Like the
Hmm.
other end of the once you detect the problem, you have to handle it properly. Which is why we've been saying to if you have been as a manufacturer, taking cybersecurity seriously, this is actually leveling the playing field for you because it forces the others that didn't take it as seriously to
Hmm.
invest in a similar fashion as the good actors have.
Hmm.
And with that, that's why our assessment is that this is actually an opportunity to generally raise the level of cybersecurity. Yeah. So it's a law. Laws are always the cause friction and
Right.
adaptation needs, but we expect that the outcome will be actually an improvement of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the reasons, obviously, why is because if you have a security failure as an organization, if you are breached, if someone inserts malware, starts stealing some private data, the point is it's not just your company that's affected. It's the individuals whose data was compromised. It's your business partners, for example. I mean, here in the States, we had that Solar Winds hack a few years ago, which was truly devious. I mean, for the bad
Mhm.
guys to piggyback on an upgrade for a security package and thus infect all their clients. Oh my goodness, it was a complete disaster. We had the CrowdStrike disaster here just a few months ago, which was really quite shocking. I mean, I still haven't heard someone get to the bottom of what really happened there, but I can tell you that from what I heard, the excuses given were were not acceptable.
Mhm.
And that's what it kind of gets down to, right? Is bad things are going to happen. We know bad things are going to happen. So organizations really need to dot their I's, cross their T's, make sure they are doing risk assessments. But I guess that, like with GDPR, as I recall, it's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how to do these things. It just tells you you must be doing something to demonstrate your responsibility. Is that the same thing here with this act?
It is in a way. First of all, the things you've mentioned, if you read between the lines of the Cybersecurity Act, the European Union has actually learned from that, like these incidents.
Hmm.
So, for example, it says that all products are covered, not just security-sensitive products, because every connected product can be used as a like a gateway to the next one. So, the one way the EU is trying to mitigate that risk is to say all devices should be secure. Um, Sorry, now I forgot your question. Um,
In other words, is it the same type
oh,
of
yes.
situation where it's not prescriptive? It doesn't tell you how to do it or which technologies to use,
Yeah.
but you better be doing something and have some, because that risk assessment is pretty important,
Yeah.
right?
So
And they're all like it. I joke that there are so many different component parts to a security profile. There's the technology, the data, the training, the risk assessments, how much of an effort do you put trying to hack into your own organization? That's one of the more forward-looking type of operations. And there was the Chaos Monkey, I think, was with Netflix. You've heard the
mhm.
story of the Chaos Monkey, where like, which is brilliant. They have a little guy who's going in there causing trouble, and you have to try to stop it. And they hit production systems, as I recall. So the point is, you've got latitude about how you can address this from a corporate perspective, but you must be addressing it, and that's the key, right, Mirko?
Exactly. So the Cybersecurity Act does prescribe risk assessment for products, basically to understand what is the potential damage if the product has security vulnerabilities. It is not very prescriptive, as you say, in how you implement all that, but it basically says what the requirements are. Like you are supposed to have policies in place, you are supposed to put the CE mark on the product to communicate that you're compliant. And the prescriptive parts are left to standards that are being developed. And that's actually one issue that we need to be aware of, is that these standards are still being developed. So the act is passed, the text is final, it's published, but the standards, for example, what are the requirements if you want to release a browser? These are not written yet, they're a work in progress. So that's one thing, if that's relevant for the products that one of our listeners is producing, then they need to look out for these standards as they get published.
Yeah. Well, and I'm scratching my head a little bit on the manufacturing side. I
Mhm.
certainly understand from the software development side, from the networking side, or application development, all the software stuff. I get the hardware stuff. I'm a little bit more curious about, are they, is the suggestion that there could be some hack baked into a piece of hardware, like a backdoor or something? Like what would a manufacturer of products do to adhere to this, and why are they involved in this game?
Mhm. I think the logic here is that most software today is actually part of devices. So like it's difficult to say this should
Hmm.
cover a software package, but not hardware the other way around. And of course, for example, if software is buggy, it can make a device attackable. Or software can be misused, data can be extracted. I mean, security vulnerabilities come in all shapes or forms. So I think it's the right approach to say in 2024 that all products that come with bits and bytes should be secure. That's the background here. Of course, it will be much harder to fix a hardware issue if you actually, like something like a CPU bug. Um, but I think it's still included in what the Cybersecurity Act prescribes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, there was great concern a few years ago. I have a friend who actually worked for the executive branch for the White House, I guess about 5 or so years ago, and he was actively involved in working on the Huawei story, where there was concern of either a backdoor or data siphoning being baked into the hardware. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about here, where if there is some sort of, as I suggest, either a backdoor or some sort of data siphoning component on any piece of hardware, is that's addressable by this act? Is that correct?
I don't think so, frankly,
No?
because the
Interesting.
act assumes that the actors, the manufacturers and the software developers are acting in good faith. They want to abide by the law. So if somebody wants to build in a backdoor purposefully to siphon off data or abuse the device or remote control it, I don't think like such a person will not care about the law. Right? So I think the
That's pretty
Cybersecurity
funny.
Act mostly focuses on um, people that want to build products the right way, follow the law, and make them secure. So this is actually an interesting question that you're asking because we've been calling this Cybersecurity Act like a sunny day scenario law. Right? It
Okay.
addresses people that are willing to or interested in acting according to the law.
Hmm.
And if we're worried about, if you look at the XZ attack on kind of the supply chain attack on software components. That is not somebody who would have stopped this because the law says that's illegal. It was already illegal, and yeah, so that's not what a market regulation is able to fix.
Interesting.
But what it does do is it encourages the safe and secure integration of open source components, and that
Hmm.
creates the necessary transparency or supports it to be able to find backdoors, for example.
Right.
As long as you have access to the source code that's on the device. I mean, yeah.
Right. And where, so the Linux Foundation obviously is a very prominent organization that is working on a regular basis to improve the quality of code, improve adoption, and so forth. Where would someone go? Because I think before the call, you had mentioned that manufacturers don't really seem to be as aware as they should be of this act and its implications. But where would someone go to make sure they're on top of things? Are there resources that the Linux Foundation offers for that?
So what you mentioned is that we've done a survey and we found that of the manufacturers that participated, 62% were not familiar or only slightly familiar with the Cybersecurity Act. Um, and that's of course a problem, especially if you're on the clock, if you're required to adhere to that by 2027. You have to do that. What resources do we provide? We are a host of open source projects. So we are getting the projects ready to support the manufacturers in their obligations. We are working on awareness across the board for manufacturers, for developers, for open source projects. And one way to do that is to develop these reports, the reduce reports that we've just published, where one of the reports covers how open source projects that we host are prepared to provide, for example, the documentation, the security advisories, and all of that that you need as a downstream user. And the other one is this assessment of the awareness of the community of the upcoming new regulation, which sadly is not so great. So
That's well, what I always muse that a person cannot reasonably adhere to a law if they don't understand it or don't know that it exists, right? But
exactly.
usually these kinds of regulations, I would argue, lean into common sense, meaning this should be something you were already thinking about, certainly from a security perspective. And these days, with how interconnected everything is, even through IoT devices, there was a big hack here in the United States of Target, as I recall, and these sneaky bastards went in through the HVAC. They actually somehow got into an IoT system, crept through the air conditioning system basically, and crawled their way all the way over to the payment system and took a bunch of money. So
Mm.
there are so many there. I mean, the threat landscape is so vast these days that it's really incumbent upon companies to make sure they're doing the risk assessments, following through, and not just going through rote procedures, but really thinking about it and focusing on it, right, Mirko?
Yeah, and I think there is no way to simply take a checkbox and just check off all the boxes and say
Right.
we're done. We've looked at the problem. I mean, you have to do more. And what we found is that there's a wide spectrum of readiness. Um, we've talked to manufacturers that have been kind of implementing 90% of the requirements already 5 years ago because they take it seriously. Now they have a small incremental option ahead of them, adaptation ahead of them, and they're working on it. And others haven't looked into it at all. And then, yeah, the clock is ticking. 36 months are not a long time if you're a corporation,
Hmm.
um, and 3 months have already passed. So,
Yeah.
um, and on the other hand, we have looked at our projects and how they integrate security practices in their development process, into the release processes, into documentation. And of course, there's also a huge variety, and the projects are set up very differently. But especially the ones that we looked at are they're projects that other products are built upon, like Yocto is a toolkit for making operating system images that then is used to build all sorts of things from small devices to cars. So this also has a leverage effect to say a vulnerability there can affect many products down the road.
Right.
And that's why we looked into these products and we find that they're actually relatively well set up. There's work to do, but you're not starting from scratch. And that means that as a manufacturer, you can adapt not just the technology coming out of these projects, but also how they're handling security, the processes, the tooling, the formats. Um, since it's open source, it's all basically ready to be studied and adopted also by the
Yeah.
manufacturers.
Well, this is wonderful stuff. Well, folks, look this gentleman up online, Mirko Broom. It's Mirko. Last name is Broehm. He's out of the Linux Foundation in the European Union. And look it up, Cyber Resilience Act of the EU. It will affect companies in the United States and around the world. So this is not to be trifled with. Mirko, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here with Mirko Boehm. That's Boehm. I misspelled his name in the last segment, so sorry about that. Pronounced Boom. Mirko is with the Linux Foundation out of the EU. And we talked a lot in our first segment about the Cybersecurity Resilience Act in the EU and what it means. And obviously, it's aimed at trying to encourage responsible behavior so we can be safe from the bad actors, of which there are many, many, many. And one interesting thing you pointed out, Mirko, about the CRA is that it really focuses on free and open source software, and it mentions that numerous times in the act. So it feels like a pretty solid endorsement for open source, right?
Absolutely, I think so. This is the first EU level regulation that not just mentions open source software, but actually puts it in the title of one of the chapters of the law. Um, and it also treats open source actors differently from manufacturers. So it makes a distinction that says if your focus is primarily on collaborating on open source technologies and ensuring they're viable, then you're an open source software steward. And that's a different role from a manufacturer. And this is important because all the responsibilities under this law that we discussed yesterday, um, they're manufacturers' responsibilities. They're responsibilities when you bring products into the market commercially.
Hmm.
And we, as an open source foundation, are expected not to do that. We provide the software, but we don't commercialize it ourselves. And therefore, the law shields us from the responsibilities of manufacturers. And that's, I think, a new approach in regulation, at least in the EU, as far as I know, where the lawmakers recognize the special role of the open source community and the difference it makes if you're collaborating and releasing the results under free licenses to everybody.
Hmm. I remember when I first began my love affair with open source was way back in 2005, and I was doing some research. I was working for the Data Warehousing Institute, tdwi.org. They're still around. I'm still doing some fun stuff with those folks, an education institute. But I was doing some research, and at the time in '05, the Apache Foundation's web server had just passed Microsoft's web server as the most popular. And of course, today there are hundreds of open source projects. There are many, many, many technologies. It's a whole movement, basically. But back then, it really was first and foremost the web server, which was a good foundation. And of course, Linux, obviously, as an operating system. And I remember learning in '05 as well, talking to Philip Russum from TDWI, because some product came out, maybe it was Oracle product, and the first version they rolled out was for Linux. And at the time, I was like, well, that's why is that? And he said, well, it's becoming a de facto standard for operating systems. And that's a wonderful thing for lots of different reasons, Mirko. But I think one big reason is transparency, because closed source software, you don't know what ingredients went into making the cake, right? So they compile it for an operating system, but you don't know what the code was that underlies that application or that technology. Whereas with open source, you do. And one of the many benefits that I've learned about with open source over the years is that bad code goes away, at least sooner or later, because many eyes make few the errors. When you have a community focused on something and it's transparent what's being built, that really adds a lot of credibility, it seems to me, and integrity to the process. And that's probably why this CRA is touting the value of open source and the value of open source stewards. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, there has been a long debate about what is more secure, open source software or proprietary software. And of course, the argument for open source software is transparency. Everybody can look at the code and then you find issues faster and you fix them. The argument for proprietary software used to be, well, if nobody can look at the code, then people
Right.
don't find the vulnerabilities and the companies are able to maintain the software better. We released a report last year called Open Source Maturity in Europe, where one of the key insights was that 76% of the respondents believe that the open source development model is more secure than the proprietary model. So
Mm.
I think this is a pretty strong verdict to say this debate is essentially over. People are not buying the argument that closed source
Right.
proprietary is more secure anymore. I think that's a sign of maturity in a way. People have understood by now what the strengths of the open source development model are and are embracing this. And I think that's one of the reasons why this new law recognizes that as well. It recognizes that to improve cybersecurity, we can't ignore the 80 or 90% of software that is open source, that it's in average in every device. Um, and so we need to make sure that this is viable and we don't disrupt the development of that software with regulation. And I
Mm.
think the EU did a pretty good job in understanding that and framing it in a way that works.
Well, right. I mean, didn't Android spin out of Unix and Linux originally, which of course Android powers all these phones around the world? I can't remember where iOS comes from, but
Mhm.
your point is well taken that open source software is everywhere. One of the other aha moments I had was on an international flight, and I was just sitting there waiting. We were getting ready to take off, and someone was doing maintenance on all the little video machines that you have, like your little TV set there, and they were doing maintenance, and it was Linux. I was like,
Of course
I
it is,
saw
yeah.
the little penguin there, and I'm like, look at that. So Linux is everywhere, and it's wonderful because this gives you a foundation. There's an expression in English that says a rising tide lifts all boats. And the idea is that you're helping everyone by bolstering this foundation that we can all rely upon. And I think that's really what open source software has become. And this CRA reflects that. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the examples that you give of like entertainment systems and airplanes and I mean, pretty much every car on the street, not every car is probably too much, but many are running Linux operating systems for the infotainment. And they're actually, some of them are built on Yocto, the project we mentioned yesterday in the report that we looked at.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there are two effects here. One is, of course, collaboratively developed software is more easy to maintain. And it's easier to fix bugs once, and it fix affects everybody who uses the software.
Mm.
And but the other one is by having such software available, we're basically allowing the businesses that develop these products to focus on what really matters to their customers. Like no customer really cares like what the operating system of the entertainment system
Right.
is.
That's right.
What they care about is that it has innovative features and it works well and it's performant. Um, and by giving the device makers such a strong foundation where the operating system and the whole framework is there, they can like shift the innovation up in the stack to what their consumers see. And I think that's
Cool.
one of the key impacts that open source has. Um, yeah, and then of course we need to make sure that this is all secure. So I think this is what the next step is about. Then.
Well, sure, you can just imagine it limits the number of OS environments that big companies need to really examine and focus on and understand. Because again, I mean, who wants to be fixing bugs all day in software? The answer is, basically no one. No one likes fixing bugs. It feels good when they're fixed. But if you have a community focused on, again, the foundation, and you, I think, made the key point here, then individual software development companies or even corporations rolling their own, so to speak, can focus on the top of the stack, if you will, the applications that provide specific tangible value to their users, to their customers, instead of trying to focus on the foundation all the time. Not having to worry about that full stack is a big deal because focus matters and there's only so many hours in any given day. So if you have a community focused on the foundation, then you can have your team focused on building the unique parts that make your customers happy, right?
Mhm. Yes, I think you're right. And maybe one warning here, if we can frame it this way, is we should not expect that the community fixes all the bugs for me.
Mm,
That's something I always try to explain is the community are our downstream users, manufacturers, sometimes hobbyists, but um, the people that are adopting the software we release and integrating them in what they are building, they are the community. And that means if you encounter a bug, you need to be aware that there's no magic community that will fix this bug for you. Um, you should better just fix it yourself and contribute that upstream. I think the
right.
difference to before is everybody does that. So you only have to fix the things that you encounter that aren't fixed yet. And that's probably 10% what you would have to do if you do this all by yourself. So it's more like a collaborative, a shared investment into the foundational technologies, as opposed to a freebie that you're getting from the community.
Hmm.
And that's one thing in the reports that we talked about yesterday. We highlight that still um, a good share of the manufacturers basically relies on upstream to get their security fixes. If there's a security fix, they basically say, oh, let's sit it out, let's wait. Um, and that's not necessarily the best approach. The best approach is to make sure that these things get fixed, that the fixes get contributed upstream. This is how the community works in a healthy way. And so we encourage all the manufacturers to go from a passive engagement, kind of downstream consumption, to an active engagement where they make sure that what they need, what their critical dependencies are, is well maintained by a healthy community.
Hmm. And you have in some of these software licenses the requirement, as I recall, to commit back to the community if you've made some significant change to the code base that you're using. Not all the licenses are like that, but the general idea is if you take an open source framework, an open source technology, and you're using it, and you find some way to optimize that in production, you really should return that back to the community and say, hey, this is what we updated, whether it's a separate project or a comment or something that someone can adopt, because there's a whole process around that. Maybe we should talk about that a bit too. But the idea is that you're encouraged to give back, and you're even contractually obliged to do so in certain cases, right?
Yeah. But there are multiple like levels of taking part in this process. The reciprocal licenses require you to publish your changes if you distribute the software. But they don't require you, for example, to go through the process of integrating those changes upstream.
Hmm.
Your license obligations are fulfilled if you make these code changes public in addition to the code. But what we see most actors do is license or not, like whether or not the license requires it, they would like their changes to be integrated upstream because it makes their life easier long term. The next version that gets released from the upstream community will contain the fixes that they have developed. They don't have to maintain them themselves anymore. So I think that um, the productive behavior of participants in our development process goes way beyond what the licenses require.
Hmm.
Um, and if you look at that, the distribution of licenses, then the majority of our projects uses licenses that don't require people to participate and to collaborate, but people really like to do it. They
Hmm.
participate voluntarily. Um, and they understand that the viability of the whole ecosystem depends on everybody doing a little part. So licenses are
Right.
great, but I think the shared understanding of collaboration is even stronger than that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's shared collaboration. And again, the key is that many eyes make few of the errors, and perspectives can really help people see problems in different ways. I've got a bunch of friends who are developers, and one of them has a great quote. He says, "Busy is the enemy of creative." And his point is that if you're just busy all the time, you're not going to be thinking of creative ideas. And so you do need to take time to think through things because if you start talking about the operating system, there's a whole stack that goes on top of that operating system that you have to worry about. So, and these days in these cloud architectures, my goodness, it gets extremely complex very, very quickly. That's why we have all this observability that has been spinning up all around us, in part because of Kubernetes. I think is a big driver in that because it's just a massive shift. I mean, I've never seen as big a shift, really. I mean, from on-prem to cloud was a big shift, but Kubernetes really, I mean, everyone had to refactor. I remember learning that MapR, which was a competitor or a contemporary of Cloudera and Hortonworks, they got acquired, I think, by HP maybe a while ago, but in like what would this be, 2015 maybe? I was talking to them and they told me they were refactoring their entire data platform to run in containers. And I'm thinking, you're a data platform company. Like, so if you're going to that level, this is the future. It's not going to go away. So the point is that, there is this very dense stack now, this de facto stack with the OS at the bottom, of course, and all these other projects, including networking, right? I mean, there's open source networking too. Lots of different things to worry about. And that's why Linux Foundation, like Apache and CNCF, you have groups, you have processes and protocols that are designed to organize and optimize the production that comes out of those groups, right?
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned, the cloud native revolution, really was a very decisive change. It essentially decoupled the applications that you're running from the underlying data center,
Right.
abstracted that away, and basically allowed us to connect resources and data centers in a way that was not imaginable before. And as a result, applications can now run on this like fabric of connected resources, um, and in a way kind of configure how much CPU they need and etc. So it is really a massive change, and that requires then, of course, that if your applications are developed on the prior paradigm, then we have to update. But
Yeah.
it's a huge increase in efficiency. And as from a developer's perspective, it feels very natural to develop this way. So I think this is one of the reasons why this has seen such strong adoption. And of course, this is
Yeah.
driven by, as you said, Kubernetes and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is one part of the Linux Foundation.
Yeah, well, it's a complex world out there, and it's getting more complex by the day. So we want whatever simplicity we can achieve and carve out, and that comes from standards. Maybe we could talk about that a bit in the next segment
Mhm.
too. Standards are crucially important, and people like most people know there are certain standards they just take for granted. HTTP, for example, hypertext transfer protocol, pretty big standard. It's been around for a while now. It helps us all connect on the interwebs, networking their standards for all kinds of things. But folks, don't touch that. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Mhm.
All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, your host Eric Kavanagh with Mirko Boehm. That's Boehm. Look him up on LinkedIn. He is with the Linux Foundation out of the EU. He's in the United States now at a conference, so we tracked him down, and we're getting lots of insights about the Linux Foundation and open source, and of course the Cybersecurity Resilience Act. But there's an interesting development here, folks. Just a couple days ago, an announcement was made that the Open Infra Foundation, so think infrastructure, the Open Infra Foundation is joining with the Linux Foundation. So, Mirko, tell us a bit about that and why that's important.
It is a super exciting announcement from our perspective. So it's exciting for me because my technical background is in cloud technologies as well. So I lived through the transition to cloud native computing, and the OpenStack technology stack that the Open Infra Foundation is developing was kind of the de facto standard before Kubernetes came around, and then Kubernetes became super big. Um, and for a long time, basically these two camps were competing, and maybe it looked like cloud native
Right.
computing would um, like completely suppress the OpenStack approach. And recently we've seen people actually doing the opposite, more uptake of open infrastructure technologies, and more development where the users of the software decide which of the technologies is more suitable to their approach or which combination of the two. So many use Kubernetes and OpenStack together, for example. Um, and that's why I'm super excited that the Open Infra Foundation has agreed to join the Linux Foundation, which allows us to converge these technologies further over time, with the goal to basically provide more useful open source technologies that are already dominant in the market. Um, Collaboration is more efficient if it gets bigger. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very positive announcement from my perspective.
Well, and so here's another key component of the story, it seems to me, is that collaboration is crucial here. And when you have disparate groups working in their own silos, well, that's not collaboration. Now,
Hmm.
there is something to be said for, let's call it hyper collaboration. Maybe too much can also be a problem because everyone has to accomplish their specific objectives. But if they're part of the same foundation, then there's greater communication about who's working on what. And I have to say, years ago, we launched a website inside opensource.org, and we had built a little technology to scan Twitter and RSS feeds and find stories about open source and publish it in a directory. So there's an easy place to find. And we haven't done a good job maintaining that over time for various reasons. But the idea was to have a one-stop shop where you could find out what was happening in open source. And let me tell you, there's so much happening. Like it's almost impossible to keep up. And this is an example of what you can do to help people keep on track of things because what you don't want is five people doing the same thing. I mean, I'll just give you an example from the Hadoop world. I remember when Hadoop took the world by storm. Of course, it came out of Yahoo, and then Google, I think it was, open sourced it. And at one point, you had like six different distributions of HDFS. And we're scratching our heads wondering, do we really need six different distros of HDFS? The answer is, of course, no. And so it went down to five, and then four, and then three. And I think it maintained three. Cloudera had one. The Apache Foundation had one. But the point is, there's that old joke. The good thing about standards is there are so many of them, right? You don't want too many standards, but you do want just enough. And the same holds true for these projects. So if someone is, like, for example, for streaming, you've got Apache's Flink, you've got Pulsar, you've got Kafka, you have different ways of doing things, but each one of them has their own pluses and minuses. So, again, you don't want to inhibit innovation. What you want is to foster innovation and collaboration. And that's the good news about the Open Infra Foundation joining the Linux Foundation, right?
Absolutely. And I think we're all aware that the only place in the world where we would like to have only like one big solution that everybody is supposed to adopt is open source. Right?
Hmm.
We would never be super comfortable with having a single company providing a technologies we cannot replace. We
Right.
would always be worried about that.
Right.
Um, so the only place where this is a really good approach is if everybody can collaborate on the technology and everybody can use it. And
Hmm.
that's maybe why um, such moves of projects growing together um, in the business world would yeah entail reviewing is competition still in play or not.
Right.
But in the open source space, growing closer together, improving collaboration can only yield positive results, as you say. So
Yeah.
yeah, very positive result for me.
Well, and I also remember a theory I came up with around the Hadoop era. If you look at the explosion of open source database technologies dating
Mhm.
back to like 2009, 2010, 2011, you just had this explosion. Got Couchbase, Neo4j. There's a whole litany of them that kind of cropped up. Data stacks, of course, Cassandra, lots of different projects. And again, they do different things. So when they do different things, that's fine. When they're all doing the same thing, that's when you have to kind of wonder. But my theory was that people were tired of having to rely on Oracle and IBM for their databases to do everything. And of course, Microsoft with Microsoft Access and SQL Server and so forth. And that lock in scares people. It scares you for lots of reasons. One, because of the cost, but two, because of the stymied innovation or the lack of agility. When you have lock-in, you don't have agility and you're kind of stuck there. So when something new comes along, it's harder to take advantage of it. And I think that that's probably one of the main reasons why this whole open source movement really took off is because when all of the development is focused inside of one company, well, their bureaucracy and their goals and their objectives and their culture then define what gets done. And the customers don't as much. And so, what we want is for, and this was actually what really excited me about HDFS, that you had a whole bunch of people from Cloudera and Hortonworks working on the same project, and that's collaboration. That's good. Now they got a little bit sideways. They really kind of went at each other for a while, and then of course they merged, which was strange. But
Mm.
nonetheless, my point here, general point, is that the collaborative nature of these open source projects is a win-win for everybody involved. What do you think?
Yeah, of course I agree. I mean, that's why I'm here. Um, but there's also just, I mean, that's something that businesses that depend on proprietary technologies have to always keep in mind is you lose a bit of freedom to operate, to make your own business decisions. If your upstream provider, your database provider, decides to discontinue the version you're using or to switch their technologies, you're not free to say, I'm sticking with the old product. You will have to like basically follow their lead. And also it gives you frees you from that dependency. Um, yeah, but the other aspect that I think is quite important, you mentioned this like variety of new database approaches that came up, and we see similar approaches or similar trends in programming languages, where for a long time we thought, yeah, maybe that topic has resolved itself. Like we have very mature programming languages, they're very powerful, but still new ones pop up all the time, and this is indicative for this kind of experimentation that is built into open source.
Hmm.
If you can do something better, somebody will try it. And if it was a crazy idea but not worth it, then it will just fade away. But maybe out of these many crazy ideas, one or two really have legs. And then they start going somewhere and they're able to actually displace very well established technologies.
Hmm.
We see this with new programming languages like Rust that have come up with special focuses in mind, like memory safety, um,
Hmm.
where when it was suggested, I think it's more than 10 years ago by now, probably most people said, well, yeah, good attempt, give it a try. Today, we take it very seriously. And this wild experimentation, even if there will be consolidation later, um, I think is one of the drivers of this innovativeness. And I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. New programming languages. There's also quantum knocking on the door. We've been talking about
Mhm.
that for quite some time. I'll kind of close with a fun quote from Dr. Michael Stonebreaker. You might recognize the name as the godfather of the modern database. He wrote Ingress like 55 years ago or something, a long time ago. And I had him on the show. Oh gosh, this is probably 10 years ago now. But he made a really fun comment back then, and it's probably just as true today as it was that back then, if not more so. He said, 80% of the code that has been written should just be thrown away. His point was that
Yes.
the world is moving quickly and you need to understand the new environment like cloud native environments. Cloud nativity is a new thing. It's a relatively new thing, and it of course is changing a little bit over time. But final thoughts from you on the importance of embracing innovation, embracing the new.
Well, we always have a balance between stability, standardized technologies, and innovation. And every change comes with cost, and it's sometimes inconvenient. But we have to be aware that technology shows that many incremental improvements over time, really over longer periods of time, can make massive differences. If we look at how data centers have changed over not in the last 2 years, but let's look at 10 years
Yeah.
in terms of cost, efficiency, um, just the power of what they can do. Small devices, look at how much functionality today we can integrate into like one little piece, like a smartwatch.
Yeah.
Innovation is very important, and we need to foster it and embrace it. And I think open source is kind of the environment where this works really well.
I love it. Well, look this gentleman up online, Mirko Boehm, Boehm of the Linux Foundation. You've been listening to Inside Analysis. Thanks, folks. Send me an email, info@insideanalysis.com.